you were initially a Labour member and then you became independent. So after asking you, was your book welcome in Europe, I'd like to ask, how was it welcome in Israel by your former colleague at the parliament? What did they thought about your change of view and opinion?
So the book, in general, in the Israeli left, was received in two ways. For many, the book basically gave history and shape and understanding to their instinctive sense, which I described at the opening, that what the Palestinians want is all of it. I think the vast majority of Israelis on the left have gone through this process, which is why you don't have today in Israel almost political representation for people who think that the reason that we don't have peace is that Israel didn't try hard enough, that Israel didn't offer enough. That part of the Israeli left has generally been devastated, and those people who read our book found that our book gave the history, the background, the language, the understanding to what they instinctively realized in the last 20 years or even 30 years of failed negotiations with Palestinians. There is still a very, very, very small contingency that opposes the book, but they're very small, who basically think that the book kind of lets Israel get away with too much, and that yes, the book might historically be correct, but if Israel only tried a little more, we would meet a Palestinian partner who would say yes to a Palestinian state in part of the land and would be willing to forego this idea of return. But our argument with these people is that this is wishful thinking. They actually cannot bring any evidence. And over the years since the book came out, I've met with a lot of groups, Israelis, non-Israelis, who say, oh, you're generalizing. It can't be that all the Palestinians want this. You know, just like you have some Israelis that want all of the land and, the same with Palestinians. And I always send those delegations to do homework. I tell them, you know what? There's nothing easier than proving me wrong. Go find a Palestinian who will openly speak to the fact that Palestinians are not refugees, that if you're born in Ramallah and you're 30 years old, you're not a refugee from Palestine, that they're not refugees, that they do not possess a right of return into Israel, and that the Palestinians should move on from this demand to focus on building a state next to Israel rather than focusing on changing Israel into a Palestinian state. I always tell them, find me one. They never come back. And really, it's easy to prove us wrong, and yet no one seems to be doing that.
Yeah, strong point. Eynat, I'm seeing in the chat room a few comments from our dear friends, attendees, and backers regarding what we're talking about when we are telling the Palestinians. Are we talking about the Palestinian people, their elected or so-called elected people? Can you elaborate a little bit more about the legitimacy of the political leader in Palestine and their ability to represent exactly the Palestinian people?
Yeah. So one of the things that our book goes really throughout the decades is, I think, put an end to the myth of the pragmatic, peace-loving, willing to compromise Palestinian people and the harsh leadership that hijacks their cause. If anything, sadly, it's the opposite. One of the things that we see throughout the history is the idea of return, the idea that every Palestinian is basically a refugee from Palestine through the generations. The idea that the establishment of Israel is a grave injustice unique to the Palestinian people, which could only be corrected by the disappearance of Israel. What we see is that this is the deepest ethos and identity of the Palestinian people. Long before they have a clear leadership, it is the Palestinian refugees who assassinate King Abdallah, who naturalizes them and wants to end the refugee situation, who prevent UNRWA from resettling any of them, who basically refuse any step that would indicate that the War of 1948 is over. It is the people themselves, the refugees themselves, who are deeply committed to the idea that the War of 1948 is open and that they are one day going to still win it through return. The leaders of the Palestinians are deeply committed to this ethos because there is nothing more important to Palestinians. This is the broadest consensus in Palestinian society. As I said, you only need to prove me wrong with one person. It is the broadest consensus and no one speaks against it. So Palestinian leaders who are willing to sometimes compromise, who are more pragmatic, understand that they have no wiggle room. They cannot maneuver a compromise when the deepest ethos of the Palestinians is from the river to the sea, which is why many of the arguments and recommendations in our book focus on the fact that getting to peace is not about getting a nicer leader for the Palestinians. It's far more difficult. It's about changing the fundamental identity of what it means to be a Palestinian. It's nothing less than that. It's only when the Palestinians move away from attaching their identity to the idea of return and perennial refugeedom can you even begin to hope to have a different leadership. And in the book, we bring, for example, very relevant for Europe, the case of the German refugees from Czechoslovakia, from Poland after World War II. They wanted return. They wanted Prussia back. They wanted the lands that became Western Poland back. They wanted the Sudeten back. Did anyone indulge them? Did any European government give them billions of dollars to set up an agency? No. And only after a generation, when they finally understood that no one is listening to them and no one has any empathy for their cause, did Willy Brandt finally emerge as a leader to tell the German refugees it's over. In the book, we actually say that what the day when a Palestinian leader will do a cut and paste on Willy Brandt's speech from 1970 after he made an agreement with Poland over the border, will know that the Palestinian people have finally come to terms with the fact that the war of 1948 is over, that the lands that they consider theirs are no longer theirs, and that they can move on to establish a state next to Israel, but not instead of Israel. We're not there yet.